Good afternoon, and welcome to our session called Technology and Transportation at the 5th Annual IoT Solutions World Congress. Just as a quick topic of conversation, and I know I can't even see hands, I'm not even sure why I'm asking this, I'm going to do it anyway. Does anybody know what it's the 50th anniversary of today? Is anybody raising a hand? 50th anniversary.
There is a winner.
Oh, he's absolutely correct. His answer was internet. On this date in 1969, the predecessor to the internet, called ARPANET, was performed between UCLA and Stanford at a room, I think, 3420. The person, Mr. Klein, was actually interviewed for this 50th anniversary event very recently in a tech magazine. In fact, that magazine article was published this morning. And he said it was actually, for him, very unremarkable, that he just thought it was something natural to do a TTY data message between two schools. He said he had a drink and then he went to bed. There was no celebration. It just seemed like a very natural thing to do. So as we are here for our IoT Solutions World Congress on the 50th anniversary of ARPANET, I think it's actually a good, outstanding time to actually talk about some of these leading technologies and where they may go. My name is Mark Kraling. I work at GE Transportation, a web tech company. I'm a solutions architect in the IoT space. I'm actually going to ask each of the people on our panel today to introduce themselves and give the position and a little bit of background. So, Helena, please.
Sure. Hello, everybody. And let's make sure, yes, it works. Perfect. I'm Helena Lisachuk. I'm with Deloitte. I lead our IoT practice globally, and the topic of mobility, future mobility, is very, very important for us. So all eyes are on it, and I'm happy to share our views.
Excellent. Thank you. Ricky?
Okay, Ricky Branner, I want to thank you, Mark, also for the invitation to be a part of this panel. This is a great set of panel here. And I'm going to give you allow me 1 minute, I'll do a quick intro of who I am, just so you know when we're talking about questions, what things I'm thinking about. My background is electrical engineering. I went to General Motors Engineering School. I spent 5 years there, then went to Xerox for 25 years doing product development and business cases and feature identification. I'm at Intel, been at Intel now at 7 years. I'm in a group called Cities and Transportation, and that is focused on ships and ports and fleet management and railways, but it's really about how do we take technologies like we have Marriott X, OpenVino, open source software, how do we do more analytics at the edge, and how do we drive that? Passion-wise, what I'm interested in being part of this panel is from a future trends, I'm always thinking about how do we make things stick? What are the end customers thinking about? Why do some technologies stick and not stick? Last thing I'll mention, and I may be showing my age a little bit here, if anybody knows VHS versus beta. And if you don't recognize that, Google it, millennials. But that was a time that I always look back and say, what happened? What was so different? Why did one stick versus the other? So anyway, I like the topics today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ricky. Sven?
So good afternoon, it's officially afternoon now. My name is Sven Schrecker. I work for LHP Engineering Solutions. We're an automotive consulting company. I actually came out of Intel for 15 years, so last year at this time I was fresh out of Intel working IoT security. So I'm the Vice President of Cybersecurity for automotive, and I also am the security chair for the Industrial Internet Consortium and work in the Automotive Security Task Group there as well.
Inside.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us here. It's always a pleasure to be back in Barcelona together with a few of my colleagues here. We're in the program committee as well. I work for Dell Technologies in the CTO office as Chief Architect for Emerging Technologies and Ecosystems. Kind of thinking about the future, 3 or 5 years and further down the road. In terms of automotive, particularly mobility systems, one of my focus areas is around the infrastructure side of things and the use of AI and other technologies, looking across the various challenges. So I'm very happy to be here, and again, happy anniversary of the internet, right?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I like to do, one of the things we definitely put in the program, and we've stuck to it, it's been a little painful, is that I wanted this to be unscripted. So you guys don't really know what's coming at you at this point. I thought it was going to be a lot easier for me to do it this way. It's actually not. I had to kind of be on my toes a little bit here too. So what I thought was going to be easy is actually going to be a little bit hard. So let's kick it off with the first one. There was a news article this morning, this morning, was actually Australia's afternoon. And a leading technology firm said the proliferation of unsecure IoT devices that's happening today is going to create what he called, quote, IoT asbestos. Something that's great today, but we're going to have a huge problem later on. So, Sven, can I get some comments on that? How do you feel about kind of the direction IoT is going right now with security? Do you think it's enough? Do you think we need more?
Well, so I like the marketing spin there on the IoT asbestos, right? So you need to fill your lungs with this life-giving air, and then you end up, with cancer 10 years later because the stuff that you were actually breathing in was nasty. So, I think we're all aware of the shortcomings of security within IoT. I think it's a larger problem. So within the specific industries, that's where the activity has to happen. Now, one thing that I did see, so I worked in oil and gas, electric grid, we did smart city, smart building, a little bit of medical, now I do automotive like I mentioned in the intro. These security techniques and the theory is quite portable across all of the verticals. When it comes to actual implementation, each vertical is very different. Some have regulations, some have standards, some have neither, and the implementations are very specific to the industry. But across the board, there are some theories and some techniques that do apply, and for the most part, a lot of it is simply the adoption and building that adoption curve. So on the birthday of the internet, right, if we look back at the internet revolution, when it was first kicking in, especially when broadband kicked in, a few months in, you realize that your C drive has been sitting on the open internet and has been completely indexed by Google for the last several weeks. So that kind of realization of the, oh my goodness point where you realize what's actually happened is still coming towards us. So within automotive, there are a number of different challenges in particular that I think we'll talk about today with the mobility space. But, I hope it is not a harsh awakening for anybody that IoT is insufficiently secured, right? Especially on the consumer side. On the industrial side, it's somewhat better. There's at least realization, but on the consumer side, I think it's a opportunity for the bad guys, and the IoT asbestos, yeah, it's going to be ahead of us.
So one of the things you just mentioned, you mentioned as you're talking about security, sometimes you may have a product or device and you don't even know what's going on, right? Whether it's Google indexing something or maybe somebody using your data incorrectly. One of the things that came up this morning, Helena, when you talked about the Internet of Humans, right? So not talking necessarily about the devices, but the human aspect.
Yes.
Can you relate a little bit to how maybe there might be some privacy concerns or things with data?
Well, absolutely, and I think you kind of saw the chart, right? And it's good. IoT was number one most lovable, understood technology, but it was only 55%. But I think we talked about the sort of a little bit of a resistance from people to accept the unknowns, number one. Number two, when it comes to topics that are privacy and security related, it comes too close to you almost physically, right? So I think the privacy, and what we covered this morning, is privacy cannot be an afterthought, same as security, and privacy needs to be understood. And it doesn't have to be an impediment. It just has to be understood and embedded into the usage and design of, let's say, connected vehicles or the parking lots or the dealerships. So actually, maybe I could give an example of how we are trying to sort of bring the awareness of how things can work, as long as, because there are like guide rails, right? So, okay, everybody looks at Europe, hey, very, very, very skeptical about privacy region, right? So we look at the connected car and we said, all right, so let's see how we could bring some facts to this. So we looked at the information that is collected as you operate your vehicle. So let's take you, Mark, you drive in Amsterdam, or somewhere actually you don't drive in Amsterdam, you bike in Amsterdam, you drive around Amsterdam, and every second, megasecond, the data is collected, sent to the tower, there's infrastructure, communication, Now, there is a big question. Okay, number one, who owns the data? Number two, everybody who has access to the data, what are they allowed to do, and how can they stay obedient within the boundaries of the law? And the first reaction from many people in this mobility ecosystem, it's a very complex ecosystem, they simply don't even know. So we kind of looked into it. We realized there are like 36 different laws and regulations in a mobility space. What can and should be done with that data just in Europe. We didn't take it globally yet. And how it can be used if you are an automotive dealer, OEM, or you are a map provider, or your connectivity provider, or completely different applies. So we just created kind of like this accelerator. Pick who you are, this is what you need to do, and this is how. And I'll pause for a second, but these are some of the things how you can just explain the concept. It becomes less scary and far more digestible, yeah?
Yep. And I know, Ricky, you and I have spent some time talking. I know you've done a lot of work as far as the user experience, whether it's in airports or other, smart cities, et cetera. Can you maybe provide a little bit of context for how you feel about this topic?
Oh no, it's absolutely a real live topic, and even in last week, the policies we definitely have to address, and those things are happening. As we talk with airports today, they're dealing with cities. They're starting to put policies in place where they're not allowing video analytics, which is we believe one of those. When we talk about what's the trends of the future, the trends of the future are happening now, and video analytics is one of those. It's in this growth area, but there's some challenges, policy challenges, privacy challenges. There's also, though, an acceptance by what I call the end customers, the passengers at an airport, for example. And for that matter, even in a restaurant, recently there was an article about, I believe it was Outback Restaurant, was doing video analytics for operations efficiency. There were some newspaper articles that said, Big Brother's watching, and some, so there's this perception that has to be addressed as well. And I think one of the ways that we're looking at how do you drive that is security is one of the ways that we've seen as a successful entry point, where people tend to be more acceptance of, okay, I know I need security. There's going to be cameras there. It's going to help security. And then you can start building on all those other use cases, because we really have just scratched the surface on use cases for video analytics at the edge. And once we start getting the people comfortable with adding one use case, add another use case, whether it's queue management, things like that, they start seeing the value. That will help some of that perception. So I think that's the piece of it. So
I appreciate it, Ricky. For me personally, and at our company, when we sell locomotives, if we're collecting data, we always say that's the customer's data, right? And so we have to have a data usage agreement or something with them directly to say what data we're going to use, how long we're going to store it, how we're going to store it, because again, it's their data. So, Syed, I know you and I have talked a little bit about this, the balance between privacy, security, et cetera. So what are your experiences on this topic?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I want to follow up on that, particularly the notion of trust. Actually, when we talk about security, privacy, trust is probably the most important thing. And I'm hoping that a lot of our audience kind of feels the same. Otherwise, come find me later. I think what's really important there in terms of that balance is what is it that we achieve out of it. This morning, Jonathan Neal from McLaren was talking about how data, particularly health data, if we use it, if we take advantage of it, if we allow it to be leveraged, we can save lives, we can make a lot more progress with a lot of these diseases, et cetera. So I think it's important. When we look at some of these other areas, particularly in transport and so on, smart mobility or the future trends, we have to find that balance. One of the government officials earlier this morning at the opening also talked about this idea of giving you the control over your own data. So the ownership is important. For us as a company, we kind of talk with our customers all the time, and there's that question that comes back, who owns the data? And autonomous vehicles, I think Sven and I have been talking about that as well. Same thing with Helena. Really, the ownership is important because we're dealing with ecosystems. It's no longer a one-to-one thing, and I think that's one of the issues to me that creates this challenge of balancing the privacy concerns, which is important, and then the security, as well as the value of that data and the processes that are going to be leveraged to create some additional potential business models or additional value for society or for the business itself. Yeah.
If I could jump in on that. So we talked about the data and the ownership. We talked about the source of the data. We talked about the privacy. We've talked a little bit about security here. But I don't think we're talking about different things. In fact, I think there's an even broader scope, right? You mentioned trustworthiness, right? So what we want trustworthy IoT, something that we are confident will do what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it. So there are a couple of different factors in there. The primary one in most industries is going to be the safety. So if you can make it do something it wasn't supposed to do and harm people, that is a safety violation. So in automotive, there's functional safety for the ISO 26262. In other verticals, they have a number of safety regulations, or at least standards. Now, the safety is generally stacked on top of the reliability, right? So functional safety will take reliability into consideration for, mean time to failure, et cetera. So the safety and the reliability are linked, and the security assures that you can't violate these safety constraints. So without the cybersecurity, does the safety actually work? Is it trustworthy? And then is the system resilient? Can it continue to function when it's under attack? And then privacy. I don't know how we talk about privacy without cybersecurity, because the cybersecurity is the enforcer of the privacy. Who owns it? Who can see it? What can you do with it? So I think this is really one discipline rather than 5 individual disciplines of safety, reliability, security, resilience, and privacy. These are really one trustworthiness discipline. And until the industries start looking at it like that, we'll have a safety team, we'll have a security team, we'll have the privacy team, and it'll be very difficult to get a holistic solution in place that actually works for an entire industry.
Thank you, Sven. I'm going to go and shift gears just a little bit. This morning's talks, I think, were interesting. I especially enjoyed hearing from the Catalonian ministers and the mayor, et cetera. The deputy mayor for Barcelona said this morning, she said, I'm very excited about this thing called the Industrial Revolution 4.0, which includes IoT devices. She said, however, I'm very worried that we're going into a phase where, the rich have the technology and the poor do not, and now all of a sudden there's a divide between, who has the technology, who has the information, who doesn't, and she was worried about it widening the gap, and she mentioned things like issues with diversity and culture, et cetera. So I want to kind of open that up to the panel, and I'm specifically asking what sort of things can we do, either as individuals or as companies, to help bridge that gap and bring technology, IoT, to everybody. So go ahead, Ricky.
Yeah, so that's a great topic, and I've seen it recently so I live in Oregon, and there's a town called Hillsboro, and in that town, there's a brand new development happening, and on the forefront, which I thought was really good. So the answer your question is working with the cities, working with the commissioners to help them understand technology and how it can be applied, because to me, and this was eye-opening for me. It's like I didn't really think about it. Of course, I know it, and that is simple things as looking for a job. You need to use the internet for that. Just to get to work, I need to know. I use the internet to get access to figure out how and where. So, if you have parts of your community that don't have access to those things, that's a disadvantage that's put on them that's unfair. And so the cities are thinking about that. In the cases of when you're building a new community, making sure you've got fiber optics, you've got some of these technologies we've talked about that enable the ability for those people to have the same access as everyone has the same access. That's what your goal is. So anyways, I think that's basically it's making sure that they understand what kind of technologies are available and what kind of things can be done from a 5G, whether it's video analytics. And again, I think we're just scratching the surface, but the more they understand about those technologies and what they can do, they start thinking about use cases they're not even thinking about today. That's what I keep telling them when I talk to the airports. I said, there's things, once you start seeing this, there's things you're not even thinking about once you start realizing the power you have.
Excellent. And Helena, I know you're from Amsterdam. I've been to Amsterdam before, a wonderful city, but it's crowded, right?
Yes, of course.
To get around, cars are really not an option. It's more public transportation, and bikes are absolutely everywhere. So, building on what Ricky said, what sort of thoughts do you have as far as smart cities and bringing technology?
Well, I think, first of all, I'd like to reflect that this was a very, very strong comment made by the deputy mayor.
Yep.
It's fantastic that she recognizes and she has kind of a long-term horizon. So it's really thinking for the benefit of the citizens and bringing the technology into it. So there are a couple of things. I think to kind of address that topic, I think it goes back to education, because the less unfamiliar it is for you, the more accepting it is. And then, good technology doesn't have to be expensive. We're not talking about the latest Apple phone here, right? We're talking about a very simple sensor that connects infrastructure to the tower. Mm-hmm. It's not expensive at all. So I think some of those elements, yes, but it's not, technology doesn't need to be expensive, but I think reflecting on kind of solving and innovating. So one of the challenges a year ago, the CTO of Amsterdam threw into a lot of companies, including Deloitte, said, look, I'm building this new district, 100,000 new inhabitants. It will be very space constrained, figure it out how all of these people can live there and operate as a miniature city with all the deliveries, with all the schools, with all the stores, with transportation in and out of work, etc., being in a very constrained environment. So go think. And it's kind of like, I don't want to use strong words like innovate or die. No, absolutely not. But I think when you are confronted with extremely concrete reason, you think about it, and technology becomes part of the solution because you see clear benefit. So, and again, it doesn't have to be expensive because you are on a state budget. So there will be a pretty clear cutoff to the point that it doesn't have to, enrich the richer and make poorers pay for it. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. It's going to be a few years, but it's in the works.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Ricky, a
I
follow-up?
want to build on what Helena was saying about when you think about a community, a planned community that's with the challenge of here's a space, make that work. One of the challenges in cities, and I believe cities and transportation are really intertwined. The challenges of cities are urban growth, and we're going to be 6 billion by 2025 as far as populations, and it was only 3 billion in 1960. So that kind of growth that's happening, it's putting challenges on cities, and one of their top 3 challenges is urban mobility. And how do you manage that? Because at some point you just don't have space to just keep growing. I just can't keep growing roads. I just can't keep growing terminals at the airports. And from a transportation perspective, you've got to figure out how to do those, and technology is a way to help you do that. I just can't add more roads, but the people are coming. The crowds are still coming. And so in those kind of environments you're talking about, those are the kind of things you think about. How do you do autonomous? By the way, when I say it's intertwined, I'll make this point. And so from cities' perspective, they're interested in urban mobility because it affects them from a transportation perspective. And transportation has these things that are going on from new advances, and that affects cities. And I'll talk about Uber, Lyft, and the impact that that's had on cities. In airports, having to actually change their infrastructure and how they manage that. The same thing will occur as we start getting into autonomous. How do you manage autonomous? Where do they park, et cetera? All those things affect the city infrastructure. So there's this intertwining that has to happen. And but I think the direction, though, is you need the technology to be able to manage the growth. 60% of folks will be in these urban centers. How do you manage that? And it's looking at autonomous, it's looking at 5G and how those things all work together.
I do want to continue that thread because I do want to talk a little bit about IoT and infrastructure because I think it's important. But Syed, you have a quick comment?
Yeah, I'll make it quick. So what's kind of interesting, we're here at an IoT conference, and data is literally centric to a lot of these processes, to the devices, et cetera. And when we talk about the cities or smart mobility, et cetera, there are elements of insights that we can leverage. Often those can be very simple. For instance, in terms of sustainability, a lot of cities are experimenting with leveraging those insights in the real world. Like if I'm doing something within 2 kilometers of my location, I don't have to drive. I can walk to it, or I can take, or I can bike if I'm in Amsterdam. So those kind of things are very simple, but that come up out of a lot of research with a lot of data that can be leveraged. So the cities need to make that available and try to drive that in a smarter way from a policy-making point of view. That's kind of was adding to that point.
That's right.
Rick is
Yeah, great topics. One of the things I do want to touch on real quick, kind of building on this, I think it's wonderful if you're building like a new city, like you mentioned out Oregon, or a new district like in Amsterdam, because then you can kind of go in and design it from the ground up. What sort of IoT technologies do you think would be key and important for cities that are already there? I mean, as you said, Ricky, you can only build so many roads and things, but what specific IoT sort of implementations would help a old city be a smart city?
One of the areas that we include as part of city transportation is roadside infrastructure and video analytics on your intersections. And the challenge you have today is with many cities is that you have different departments. And I can't stand it when I go to an intersection, I say, oh, there's a camera. That camera is just for checking speeders. Well, there's another camera. Oh, that camera is checking traffic management. Different departments created this. What we try to do within our smart cities infrastructure is start to create a common use case, get the departments talking to each other, because the same cameras can be used for multiple use cases and save the city money to do that. So once you've got those there, and you can start looking at, obviously you can look at traffic flow, you can look at ways to, you can change the flow so things are more efficient. But one of the other areas that we've been looking at with our open source software is looking at libraries to do near-miss detection. So not just counting crashes, and then obviously you can count crashes, determine how do I make things flow better, but near misses, things that were almost accidents. That's information, that's data that's very valuable that can help you figure out, okay, how do I manage better and make this more efficient, change the flow of things. even when you look at smart parking, using that, starting to take this video and really starting to add those use cases, even in a parking lot, even within Intel, we said, oh, we can use this information so we can know where, these are crosswalks where pedestrians are supposed to walk, but where are they actually walking, right? And so if we understand that, we can change things how they flow. One of the big things I see going on in cities is a lot of them are going with what they call a not zero tolerance, but the zero death, right? They basically said, we want 0 fatalities from traffic accidents. So using data like this built into you can add it to the current city, right? And you can start getting the data that helps you make those kind of decisions.
Excellent. Sven?
Yeah, okay, so I understand the desire to go to 0 deaths, right? It's a safety thing, and I understand that the technology will fuel this and enable all of this, right? But we need to be careful that we don't get the technology too far ahead of the sanity, okay? So it's changing everything. It's changing the society. So my son is 16 years old, and in America you get your driver's license when you're 16, and I'm gonna assume that all of us were looking forward to that moment, and the second we could do it, we were in line to get the thing. My son turned 16, came and went, no driver's license. Turns out none of his friends have driver's license. Nobody cares about a driver's license, right? They get a rideshare app, right? So, which is supposed to be 18 and up, but that aside, the interesting thing is, we're talking about an app on your phone. Okay, this is not autonomous driving. This shouldn't have this kind of impact on society, right? An app on the phone has made that kind of impact on these kids. So once we start talking about these technologies, I mean, these are actually transformative.
Yeah.
What happens there? Have we stopped? Have we thought about this, right? I mean, just the privacy considerations there. So let me ask you this. For those of you over 30, if you wind back, 20 years or so, and you say, well, for all of these modern conveniences, for all of this technology that we have, would you want that if you realized that you had to give up all of your privacy, right? They know everywhere you go, they track you everywhere, everything you buy, everything. Is that a trade that you would have made? It's hard to say because now we're used to it, and there wasn't a choice. It was sort of like boiling a frog slowly, right? If you drop a frog into boiling water, it'll hop out. But if you boil it slowly, it won't realize, and you'll cook it, right? Have we been cooked? What actually happened here? And how is this going to change in the future? Are we aware of what we're actually doing here? And there's no way this is going to stop. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it can stop, or that we even could stop it. But where do we step back and think about what's really happening here? What are the implications and the side effects?
I certainly, I think I agree with you, right? So a lot of the things that Ricky was talking about, I was kind of cringing a bit. I'm from the South in the United States, which is probably the most suspicious of everybody and everything as it is, right? So red light cameras, no, we don't have those because there's no way it might make people slow down, it might make people not run red lights, it might make me safer, but I don't want people watching me, right? So it's that kind of aspect. Sai, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, by the way, you opened up a really good discussion there. When I look at this, and please think about this for a second for our audience, we talk about trends in technology. I think we are the ones who are changing, which is kind of what's happening with the kids, right? So the changes, the technology is moving at a fast pace, and in fact, it's going to continue that way. As you heard this morning as well from another number of examples. But actually, I truly believe that we are being changed by technology, not just behavioral, but actually in a number of ways, being more analytical, looking at some of these tools, et cetera. So that's one, I wouldn't call them side effects, but probably one of those examples, right? And there are a number of others in the way we look at these things. So I can't dare to think about 100 years from now what's a human 20-year-old or 25 or even 50-year-old would look like or be like in terms of their behavior. But I think the impact of these trends and technology is kind of really profound, in my view. Yeah.
No, for sure. Switching gears just a little bit. One of the things I like to think about, and in fact we need to talk about during this panel because it was one of the key topics of conversation, is what technology trends, I'll open up to anybody in the panel that wants to answer. In fact, all of you can answer if you want. What technology trends have you seen in IoT over the last year or two that you're most excited about? What's the one thing you're like, you know what, that's gonna make a difference, that's gonna go somewhere? Anyone?
There are so many.
Yes, there are. Right. There are. I mean, I mean, even I'm excited. I mean, I've been at Intel now 7 years, and in different groups within Intel, data center. I've been on the client side with PCs and workstations, and then in IoT in the last year and a half here. And the interesting thing to me is I look at the technologies that we're involved in. We're involved, and I think this is probably true for most companies. You're involved in many of them: 5G, analytics, and video analytics, and autonomous, et cetera. And I think they all have a shot. When I always look at which technologies are going to go, which technologies are going to stick, I start thinking about, and you can test me if this is something you think makes sense or not, or it feels right, is it solving something that already exists and makes it so much better that it becomes seamless, it's for the user experience, and also that it what I call fits like a glove. It's so easy to use, so easy to do. An example I'll use is related to Facebook and social media, not just Facebook, social media, and just how people connect. People have been connecting for centuries. That's not anything new. So what did they do? What is social media doing that's different than what happened before? And I think about my mother, who is now 84 years old, and she's a whiz on the phone. Actually, we got her a cell phone, and she's oh, I love my computer. This is great. She's looking up stuff. It's amazing to me because it took her a while to get used to it, because she used to connect simply by telephone. I was like, I remember those days. That's how you connected. You had one phone in the house, and everybody had to share it, and that's how people you connected, right? And there was no caller ID. It was just phone rang, you picked it up, right? So when you think about social media and what it's done, it's really just taken that and found a way to make it happen so it's so much better than what we do, and it's accelerated, right? It's this acceleration you're talking about. And in some ways, it's like that acceleration is like, oh man, how are we gonna, this is really affecting how we do things, but at the same time, it's doing so much good. So that's one thing I think about, and if I look forward and I say the technologies are gonna be trends in the future, right? The trends are gonna be, they're already here today. If you think about which ones of those trends are really solving things that you already do and making them so much easier that you're starting to gravitate to it.
I think that's an excellent point. One of the things you mentioned, your 84-year-old mom using a phone. My mom, there's no chance, right? So I think you might be the exception to the rule, not the norm. But that does bring up, actually, this morning one of the Catalonian ministers mentioned, hey, I understand you guys are driving IoT technology and you're doing all these great things. Think about who you're leaving behind, right? There's like a human element that's involved here. So don't go so far and so fast that it makes sense for you, but you're leaving behind, most of your audience. So I think that was a great point. So, Syed, any thoughts at all on?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'll take it in a different direction. Really, one element of it is we have now this stability in terms of the maturity of the research and the solutions are coming out, and particularly driving areas of predictive maintenance. As an example, we see a lot of cost saving and these conversions in terms of infrastructure from a technology point of view. And those elements combined now, IoT and AI, for instance, are two examples that are pushing in that direction with a number of applications. Healthcare is another one. We heard this morning about automotive, and we're talking about connected and smart mobility. Those are elements that are actually starting to make progress. Probably over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a lot more direct adoption of those things. So I think maturity, especially we're at the 5th year of IoT Solutions World Congress, we've been talking about what's going to happen next, et cetera. So we're seeing more solutions now. Smart buildings is another area where we talk about sustainability, a lot of technology that's being used, leveraging IoT solutions to deal with plastics, for example, in the oceans, which is a big issue, as you know. So those kind of things are happening, and I see a lot of those examples promising. Yeah.
Okay. Helena, some follow-up?
Well, just to add a little bit, because I can't agree more, I think we're not talking just about IoT. There is no IoT in isolation, right? There is data, there is communication, there is aggregation, there is sensors, there are actuators. It's an entire ecosystem, and technologies need to work together to actually solve a problem and to provide a benefit. I am particularly excited about the convergence of all of them, and that people are becoming far more comfortable applying the technologies and actually building the solutions you're talking about. think when it comes to mobility space, some of the most exciting things I've seen recently was actually the connected ambulance with 5G network. Because A, it moves, it's mobility. B, it saves lives, because the intervention you can actually apply in the first 2 minutes of event or incident are quite powerful to save a life of a particular person. And you can do this now if you have proper infrastructure in place, right? So some of these examples, an evolution of connectivity, I think is very exciting because, okay, 5G is kind of high-end, but there is things like narrowband IoT, super related to urban mobility, right? Fairly inexpensive, long-lasting sensors that are live with batteries for 10 years. So I think it doesn't always have to be like going after the most extreme, super expensive, very impactful use cases, but thinking about very economical, budget-constrained environment of public sector. I think that needs to be a check.
So I agree with that. And one of the challenges here is that convergence of these technologies, like you were talking about as well. So where these things all need to come together and improve and solve real-world problems. So if you take a step back and look at the big picture, it took all of human existence to get to our first industrial revolution, and that's where human power and animal power were removed and steam and mechanical power came in. So that took all of human existence. And then it was about 100 years before we hit the second revolution, industrial revolution, with electricity and so on. It was about another 50 years until we kicked into the third industrial revolution, which was computers and automation. The fourth industrial revolution is now IoT. So we're in the midst of this. So if we extrapolate forward, this one should be about 12 and a half years, right? And so we're about 10 years into that, so we're getting sort of to the end of the fourth industrial revolution. So the question is, what's the fifth going to look like? And then if you extrapolate that out, the fifth will take about 6 years, and then about 3 years to get to the seventh, 18 months to get to the eighth, getting down into 9 months to get into the ninth, right? So these things are going to start really, the rate of technology evolution is increasing, and the complexity is going through the roof. So at what point does the rate and the complexity get to a point where it's very difficult to sustain, right? How can we sustain that? Now, not to leave you with I feel like I'm up here just like saying all this negative, like sad, depressing stuff, but there are ways to do that, right? I mean, there are solutions. So if you think about it, if you use the internet today, if you go to a website, you're probably hitting a back-end database. There's a whole bunch of complexity there that you don't see. It's covered up with interfaces to simplify. So how do we do that across IoT, across a convergence of multiple technologies? How do we even talk about that? I don't know that the vocabulary exists today to talk about problems at that level of scope. And once we can address that, then we can start to get all these solutions together. Maybe that's what the fifth industrial revolution will have in it as part of it.
Excellent thought. So we're getting close in our time. So I'm going to pose a last question. However, you don't need to answer that question. You can just kind of give summarize your thoughts if you want. One of the thoughts I have is Ricky, you talked about, hey, we can put all this stuff in a city and set up infrastructure side. You kind of covered some of those points as well. If you get to things like automated vehicles, and Uber's going to have something where it'll just pick you up and drop you off, and there's no driver on board. Obviously, cities need to spend a lot of money on infrastructure to make that happen. So now all of a sudden you have a city spending money for something that doesn't directly benefit it in the end, right? So I don't know what thoughts you guys have on some alternative business models or things of that type. So what I'll do is I'll let Helena kick it off. Helena, by the way, has sessions tomorrow that I'd highly recommend to see. Women in diversity in industry, which I think are extremely important topics. So please check out those sessions tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think the whole shifts in alternative business models, we could talk about it for like 3-4 hours and maybe have another breakout and a workshop if you're interested. Yeah, but it's just you have now new assets that you could use, and you can come up with different ways how the value is being created. And a connected car and a mobility ecosystem was one of those first domains that we actually explored and realized so much investment is being made by OEMs and tier 1 suppliers, but then the value was being captured in completely different industries. Saeed and I talked about it 3 years ago, right, at one of these events here, how the value is being shifted completely. Who's making investment is not necessarily the one who's benefit. Now, I think being aware of it and then trying to bring the value, if you're talking about a city and urban mobility, citizens should be the one benefiting first and foremost, right? Not necessarily the other sort of like revenue-making machines around, like, we talk about shares, da-da-da. So I think it's also a mind shift, but it's also realization that investments are not, 5G investments that are required at this moment in time. This is another one that's not necessarily proportional who will be investing versus who will be getting the direct benefit. It's just being mindful about it and accepting that in the new future of mobility, it will be always a trade-off, and there will be possibly multiple futures existing with different usage of data, autonomous things, share, value creation in multiple ways. So future is bright, but there will be multiples of them.
Excellent. And Ricky, thank you for flying from California. I know you and I have been working pretty closely over the past couple of years. I've enjoyed our relationship. So final thoughts?
Final thoughts, yeah, I'm going to build on your value creation piece because I think that is the standard to bear. We studied multiple airports and talked to CIOs, CTOs, and we said, what do you think, what's a smart airport look like in the future? And we talked to stadiums, and we call these micro cities, airports, stadiums, railway stations. And I was surprised that the response was, we're not trying to be a smart airport. We don't even use that terminology. It's all in the media. You can Google smart city, smart airport, it's all there. But when you actually talk to the investment in technology, they're looking at, I'm just trying to solve problems. And if you can show where it's helping them solve their problems, working with their constituents, that's going to be the driver that gets them engaged. And the how gets into a lot of public-private partnerships is going to be one of those ways of how that happens.
Excellent. Sven, the master moderator, he has 3 more sessions, I think, at the conference.
Yeah,
and
so
if
let me
anybody
give you
wants to see what a moderator is supposed to do, it's actually him. So.
Let me give you a shameless plug for that. So tomorrow I have an automotive technology session in the morning. We have one on 5G plus Li-Fi, so convergence of 2 technologies coming together. And then we have an afternoon session upstairs, actually, for the IIC on the security working group. So I'll leave that as the closing and give Saeed the rest of my time.
So Syed, I do want to do a quick introduction. He's been my co-chairman for the Connected Transport Track, so he and I have been working very closely over the past year. So it's been a good relationship. We'll see if we do it again next year. We don't know. So thank you.
It's been great. Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just get a couple comments. Let's call it the money question for the data. Not data is created equal. To your point, Mark, things can be very expensive. The budgets are not there, the funds are not there to support these future trends. And I think for the startups that are out here or the entrepreneurs looking at IoT data management or IoT data monetization will be something that will be very helpful. I think that's going to happen anyway. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. It's been great. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists. So round of applause for them, please. They did a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
And that concludes. Have a great conference. Thank you.